Hello and welcome to the Dugout. Happy Black August. This month we plan on getting a lot of good stuff coming at you. Interview from Eric King, an episode about the history of Black August, actually a couple episodes about the history, legacy, and observation of Black August. We're excited to get that into y'all, but first we really wanted to share this interview that I did on the Organic Filament Network, and we really recommend folks go check them out. Their interviews are very thoughtful and really important for us to be thinking about as internationalists, as decolonial scholars and activists. And after you're done listening to our interview, I highly recommend the ones they did right before us, The Piety, Hierarchy, and an Ethical Life with Arsalan Khan, and Martyrs, Murals, and Memories with Sudan's Asel Diab on Art, Grief, and Revolution. They're graffiti artists from Sudan, living here in Turtle Island now. Very impactful stories. Love who Cher Ali Khan, who does the Organic Filament Network, has been interviewing, and can't wait to see more of their growth. Y'all should go check them out.
Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Cher Ali Khan. Today I'm speaking with Jordan, co-creator of The Dugout, a platform rooted in Black anarchist thought and lived political clarity. This conversation moves through themes of Palestine, gentrification, surveillance, the failures of electoral politics, performative protests, and what it means to build under siege without compromise and without performance. Welcome to the show, Jordan. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good today. I'm excited to be in this conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an honor to have you here. And before the show began, we were discussing In the Belly. Can you tell a little bit about your work and what you've been working on lately on the organizing front?
Yeah, In the Belly is a abolitionist publication that was formed inside of Pennsylvania's Department of Corrections in SEI Fayette by a couple of revolutionary abolitionists, and they work with some folks on the outside to get their publications. They collect writings, have it sent to like a PO box on the outside, and it gets gathered, aggregated, and republished back into over 500, 600 subscribers currently on the inside in Turtle Island. And I'm a part of the editing team on that, where we just gather the stuff, work with the rest of our editorial team, which is majority currently incarcerated abolitionists, and helping the logistics of that comms and stuff run through. Yeah. We just celebrated our 5-year anniversary, actually, so that was wonderful.
This is really important work that you're doing. And I was looking over some of your earlier episodes on The Dugout, and you've said that your politics comes from what you've survived: housing instability, overdose response, loss. Was there a moment where anarchism stopped being like a concept for you and started feeling like something you were already living?
Yeah, definitely. I would say it definitely got into, when I got into more formal organizing spaces, like post 2020 after the rebellion, I got mainly into environmental organizing, and that to me and a bunch of other things, it really got me. I found myself with the anarchists and with that kind of community without really being able to like find the label around it. Because I feel like it's definitely been like a connecting path of something that's like more not said, more like an ethics of how we operate, or at least our ideals around how we operate, and then trying to create modes of working through problems with that sense of ethics. So it's always been the people that wanted to do something and also talk about why what we were doing wasn't working in a very like critical, but also hopeful, or not even hopeful. Yeah, hopeful way. And I felt like that drive for like taking action, but action that had like a material impact, was something that I've always had inside of me. And when I was able to like actually have a communal relationship with that impulse with other people around me, that was beautiful. And through naming it, I've been able to extend that arm of community, but also extend beyond what that box is.
Cedric Robinson reminds us that the Black radical tradition isn't about reform, it's about rupture. When you look back at your own political break from sort of respectability politics, or from the state, or from spaces that so-called called themselves radical, what helped you to sort of hold that line?
I guess my memory. I've always been obsessed with the archive and expanding like publicly accessible information. And I guess because there's so much like real life treasure there that in any moment, like there's so many different perspectives to look back on and relate to our current. And it's in the memory of those who have fought before me, who have debated before me, who have lost and who have won before me. In those martyrs that I find community, even when alone, to stand against something and to drive me towards something beautiful. Having like the accessible information of like past revolutionaries, but also just past people trying to solve problems that are similar to ours, and being able to find a unity in that has helped me especially. And then the other people, especially like in respectability politics, having the other people around me that are just trying to also form that new response instead of one that's stagnant.
And when we think about left spaces, I feel like Black anarchism gets sort of pushed to the margins. What made you feel like for the Dugout, you had to name what you were doing for what it was on your terms?
Well, one, because we're anarchists. A firm belief of ours is voluntary association, and like our Black anarchism and our media call out and our media like involvement in this space is to unify that, not unify, but to have a space to collect that type of thought. And because one, it is so very dispersed, and it again goes back to that language and that memory aspect of we can only know what's accessible to us and what other people can teach us. And there have been so much beautiful reproductive labor to keep the information of like self-sustaining, self-managed revolution alive that we felt that there was a bit of a dip in it in this Black anarchist region of it. And there was also an upswing. And it's part of what has flavored my introduction into like really trying to study left and radical history over the past 5 years, even more, is always finding that anti-authoritarian trend and using, I mean, as much as we can label something, we can label it to death until we can overcome it or blend it or fusion or have things that actually serve us. I think for us, it serves as a rallying call as much as it serves as an identifier of our lineage from Black power to being property to being anti-property.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
You've talked about organizing in white-dominated unions or activist spaces in your podcast that sort of weaponize radical language, but still reproduce violence. What lessons do you carry from those experiences into the kind of political work you do now and who you do it with?
I mean, we're a big, heavy believer in prefigurative politics and organizing something in the now. I think it's a Zapatista phrase of, not the organizing in the shell of the new, but trying to just create what we need now. And I think we look to models, like internationally, we do look to models that do have things which are like the Zapatistas, like the MST down in Brazil, like the original Soviets in the USSR, these projects of like really localized self-management that allows for larger communalism. And with that in mind, when we try to organize, to me, it's about like, where's the accountability? Like there's going to be a structure. So how do we structure it in a way that actually like abolishes really easy abuse that we see in these spaces? Whether it be of power, clout, or resources. And in that...
You've talked about organizing in white-dominated unions or activist spaces that weaponize radical language but still reproduce violence. What lessons did you carry from those experiences into the kind of political work you do now, and how and who you do it with?
I think, it's that emphasis on where we put our labor and trying to build prefigurative systems now, but also like understanding what kind of organizations that are like larger or mass organizations I want to join and how, because I have like an affinity group, like a group of 5 to 6 folks, and we have like a mutual aid network and stuff, and we support each other, and sometimes some 2 or 3 of us will join a scene or a group at a time, because it's like there are larger structures that are worth being a part of and not ceding to authoritarian ground. And I think as anti-authoritarians trying to organize in those spaces, like there are some unions, and there's like in some of the big unions are cadres inside of it that are organized to make the union more democratic, or stuff like that. I feel like it still can be useful, but being able to then work for actual accountability processes, like a good distribution of power and decision making, and resource allocation is something that I've held strong through that.
I think you and Prince have both talked about Palestine not as like a metaphor or a hashtag, but something that's directly tied to the Black liberation, or something tied to Black liberation. What does meaningful solidarity look like in this current moment that we see ourselves in?
I mean, I'm biased. I'm an anarchist. I'm a decolonial activist. So, and by saying I'm an anarchist, I mean, I want the no world, like the big world no state solution where we all are democratically confederalists and we have our bottom up communities. So those are my comrades dying. Those are my comrades fighting. Those are my comrades fighting authoritarianism. And to me, that means destroying the weapons that are attacking and the tools, dismantling the tools that are being used against them. And as an American, someone inside this empire, directly, spatially, there are very material ways for that to happen, from blockades to actual sabotage to organizing, even like very above ground like pressuring your city council to stop funding very specific things. No more trips to training in Israel, no more training for this. There are like the way that speaking the language that they do, which is that we all do, which is we have our resources, and those resources can be a choke point. And we've seen some of that here in the States, but I think we've also seen things that don't address the material need of those who are calling for our action. And that means like even the very material impact of the encampments was a giant seismic shift in the mentality of folks, which may not have directly stopped any weapons from going, but radicalized folks that and entrenched their internationalism to a point that led to material relationships being built, to actual plans being made. And that was beautiful. And that was like something that we could see more of.
And it's kind of weird because like so much of solidarity now happens on corporate platforms, like their tweets, reels, infographics. But those are the same sort of platforms that surveil us, and corporations, obviously like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, their algorithmic violence, and they profit off our grief. How do you navigate the contradictions of doing political work in spaces designed to sort of extract from us?
I mean, it's knowing what terrain you're on and moving tactically. And being a revolutionary in America, you have to know what it's like to be behind enemy lines constantly, and what that means for, one, your operational security, and two, for the kind of tactics and that can be used to implement like a strategy. I think for us here in the States, or honestly anywhere, because this is a movement that's happening, is that like the internet is very new. It is like 30 years old. I think like Facebook drops 30 this year, and stuff like that, like ARPANET, like what was before the internet, like that's like 60 years old. So it comes from these top-down state military infrastructure and has slowly become into the public accessibility. And we have our landed gentry, our Zuckerbergs and all that stuff. And I say, like, we know how to treat kings, and we have a whole history of fighting this avenue. And just because they own the digital landscape that we have now doesn't mean that it can't be democratized. That being said, I think it's one of those moments of like, we need, like, the software engineers got to be organized. Like, the collectives have to come up. Like, nobody organizes people better than the people doing the labor itself. And there is that thing, but it's a very resource heavy and like legitimized resource heavy playing field. Because there were alternatives to Twitter with like the Fediverse and Mastodon, which is basically the same thing that Blue Sky is trying to do, except they got Jack Dorsey right behind it now. And so it gets a little bit more legitimacy. Same with I'm like Loki a tech nerd, and like now they're trying to do Bluetooth to Bluetooth like chat stuff, which has been around in community forever. We were using that here in Columbus when we had an unhoused encampment that we were supporting, and we couldn't buy everyone's cell phone service, but we could get phones and you could have Bluetooth to Bluetooth chat so that if you're at least near the camp, you can have some sort of connectivity to those that you were living with at the time. So I think it's all about like using these tools that we have around us and finding what's accessible to us, what labor do we need to make things. And I think starting from that mentality of what do we need? Because in every war, we need engineers, and now we definitely need our software engineers, and we need to be organized in that capacity. And I think that's kind of the solutions or part of.
That was really well said. The Zionist logic of collective guilt, like no innocence, mirrors U.S. state violence that treats entire communities as threats. What role does Black anarchist thought play in resisting that logic while still organizing?
I think it comes from, the first thing that comes to my mind is understanding Black culture, and that it's something that is formed in the tight underground community, but extracted from, mimicked, and morphed, and also absorbed beautifully by like the world and everything around us. And I think that starting on the underground, working and finding language, results, and relationships, and expanding beyond, but keeping that focus on who you're actually accountable to, is a lesson from Black culture and Black anarchists that I can find. Because even, I would say, like, some of the most militant Black anarchists will never know their names because they were all in the BLA and, like, in the Black Liberation Army, and they went underground. And, like, while their structure was more anarchisty, not all of them were, but I think it's a hell to be said that I also think a lot of Black anarchists, like a lot of anarchists, don't call themselves that because it's only useful to a certain subsect because of how pigeonholed and gatekept information and language is, and the wars around identity. So I think a way to fight on that front without making yourself totally exposed is to do it in comfortable spaces and expand from there.
Afro-pessimist thinkers argue that anti-Blackness is sort of total, that Black life exists in a state of social death outside the category of the human. But you've also pointed out to the limits of that framing through your podcast. How can that sort of thinking flatten what people actually live, feel, and build? And how do you hold space for both structural clarity while still making meaning, still fighting, still imagining?
Yeah, I think the issues with some of that thinking is how it can fit into people's preconception of the world and like how cultures are formed. Because to me, I still find it true. The world is inherently anti-Black, but it's a world. And for the freedom of Blackness, that world does need to be destroyed. And to do that, you build your own world. There are still other worlds out there beyond the like hegemonic pan-European settler, like imperial impulse and necessity to control those resources. And that still, to me, like any world around it will be influenced by that hegemonic impulse, but same as we influence it. And so we still have to deal with all that anti-Blackness in the new worlds that we create and the worlds that we traverse to. But I think it gets flattened when people see it as like the only world there is and there's nothing beyond it. And I think like the solution or the endpoint to Afro-pessimism, because it's not an ideology, is that it's just a framework or a narrative around how Blackness is treated, how it's always a factor. And that being said, things can be less factors or factored in different ways with different quantities, with different qualifications. That I think, yeah, it gets down to the base value system of how we create things and how we think about the different worlds that we want to live in.
In episode 1, I think Prince critiques how films like Judas and The Black Messiah can flatten rebellion into spectacle. What's the danger in visibility of Black radical work, and how do you stay strategic without being consumed?
Yeah, I think about that often, especially around that film, because I have to get this right. I gotta look something up.
Absolutely.
Akua Najeri, Fred Hampton's partner at the time, she didn't want that film to come out for years, and she was a part of building that film, because she eventually did it.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and she was on set, and so was Fred Hampton's son. And there were a couple points where Fred Hampton's son, Fred Hampton Jr., and Akira were like, man, we're about to walk off the set. Like, this is BS. And you got some changes in there. I think the danger is that it does I think even Frantz Fanon, my favorite part of Wretched of the Earth is just that essay on national culture. And the way that it talks about, one, how violence is depicted in media to kind of soothe or give someone an outlet for a sort of fantasy or imagery. And I think that's the danger. I also think that it's very dangerous for them to still publish it, because media is such a powerful tool and it lives in people's mind. As long as we're consistent in our narrative imagery around that sort of thing, I think it's very possible to subvert the danger. Because I mean, it's kind of like the thing of like, oh, how does Andor come out on Disney? And it's like, well, there are anti-fascist writers and they get jobs. That's half of what the Red Scare was. And I think that it will, like, that type of imagery will get through, and some of it will be genuine. But I think our danger too is that we think that the movie is enough or the imagery is enough, and don't always take like the really slow time to build in real life what's needed, because we get fixated with like historical flashpoints at some times, and it becomes like this whole discourse haven, which the archive is there to educate us, entertain us, not necessarily pacify. So yeah.
And we see sort of similar processes in like movement language, where like grief, mutual aid, abolition gets co-opted and commodified. How do you hold on to, again, that political clarity when survival work gets packaged and sold back to us, just as an organizer and in your discussions on the podcast?
Yeah, I think it's that point of consistency. Because we're going to consistently get bullshit thrown at us. And I think people, and also moving at the speed of trust. And this is what I think like the real beauty in just like working with your neighbors and neighborhood associations. They're just having a meeting at the library and inviting all your friends that live with you and all the people down the street to it. You're also a point of contact and a point of information. And everyone moves at the speed of trust, whether that's like false or not, however it's earned. And I think being a consistent voice for another narrative is what keeps something alive and allows it to develop, to like actually be something that reaches people and actually come from a place of mutual respect and mutual relationships. It's kind of this point of me where I'm like, if you can't talk to politics with your neighbor or with your coworker, you need to iron out your politics a bit. You need to battle test your politics a bit with just real conversation with people, because people have other concerns to not think about what somebody who's chronically online or chronically political thinks about.
What's interesting about your background is your work has been rooted in harm, care, and survival rather than clean sort of aesthetics of politics. And when you talk about that kind of underground work, it reminds me of Ashanti Alston, and you just like referred to earlier in the conversation, which was the prefigurative space where we live freedom before it's recognized. What does that space look like for you, and what sustains it?
For me, I mean, there's a lot to be done, but what sustains it? So there's a lot to be done. I've been thinking about this question specifically a lot, but because I have spent the past couple years kind of divorcing myself from different political formations to make space to analyze a bit more and to make space to educate and train and study.
Which is an important phase to go through as an organizer.
Yeah, I think it's very important. To me, I'm obsessed with bringing back the anarchist labor and economic tradition, because I feel like it's what brings fun. It's something consistent. You can bring material change from material grievances that people have. And two, I think that it helps us break down these conversations of, like, to me, what kind of world we want to live in. A lot of radical folks, when they think of changing the world, maybe they're still thinking of like some centralized state that's doing economics. And to me, that's not my goal. My goal is a very fragmented and decentralized economy. And in doing that, that means like building associations of co-ops, of communes, and kind of looking back to that tradition of like what started like the USSR and in Venezuela and in China, and these communes and these collective units, like economic units. And to me, that means like I eventually want to live in the world where we have all of our resources. We have a way to distribute that equitably, and people can still produce. People can still make artisan bread if they want and give it to people and sell it or whatever. People can still like plan weddings and do all this. Like I think like what is this kind of societal infrastructure that is less centralized around the state or giving the state more power versus creating more autonomous political institutions and associations that may be state funded because that's our money, but not state ran. So like thinking about the different ways that we can like socialize those sorts of things. And to that, it's how do you then collectively manage resources, which is what I think that everyone could be doing and bringing into any organization they're in now, which is like what sort of organizational frameworks, decision-making processes, roles, leaderships, recallability, different things that we're working in to make a more self-managed and voluntary society. And here locally, we have like the Cooperation to Action, the Network for Land and Liberation, and like trying to look and model themselves more off like the MST down in Brazil that like occupy land, take it, and still fight the government, but have the overall goal of revolution, but have the right now goal of sustaining a populace and actually building some sort of like communal network that people are accountable to. And to me, that's a nationalism without the state. That's a communal political project that we can work for that's outside of the current structures.
That's really interesting. And I think it comes back, if prefigurative spaces is about living freedom before it's recognized, then Kwasi Balagoons reminds us that it also takes discipline and strategy, not just desire to imagine or to live our anarchism. And in your own work, what does that sort of readiness look like when things get messy, and what would you recommend to other organizers or people who are thinking about anarchism?
To me, the best thing to stay prepared is to be organized. It's what I've seen like through history. Even that's why like everybody's favorite militant formations comes out of a not so militant formation. And I think that's because one, there needs to be a space for like to actually prepare for those conversations to happen. And in that space, one, dissent will always form. But I think in preparing around it, it's about having as many relationships to build off of that when things get really messy, there's some sort of knowledge, of trust that you can lean on. And I don't know, I always think it's really interesting when you're always hearing the anarchists just say like, get organized. Because I've always been called someone who's like a destructuralist or something like that. And I'm very much into how the structures work. And I feel like that's what actually drives me to anarchism, is that study of like the velocity of power or how things like are managed in a space. And yeah, I just think that in preparing for things to get messy, like trying and experimenting things when you feel like they're all right. Because I find a lot of inspiration from the comrades in Rojava and in Syria who were doing the local councils and doing that sort of organizing in wartime. And I think if we have the luxury in the same politics, we should be trying everything that we can to do that while we're not in a militant hot phase. And that might just mean like stocking up on things. And I think like there is like a small prepper anarchist space. And I think the best way to talk about to like stock up on items is to talk about like what you actually need. What is a real risk assessment? What are the actual like possible harms that could happen to your community? What are the things that are consistent? And or maybe that looks like what kind of labor is needed. Because I mean, the people who do most of the medicing, who do like a lot of the support work for protests that aren't always a part of the organization putting it on, are usually just autonomists or anarchists that have knowledge and have organized themselves in that capacity. And I think that's like the space for it to grow.
Like seeing who's being targeted and why. You've also said that capitalism doesn't just exploit, it disappears, it kills, it isolates. What does racial capitalism mean to you when it shows up in housing, policing, and even the language of solidarity?
To me, I guess when I think of like capitalism and racial capitalism, because to me they're one and the same. They're just like, it's like having to, I don't know, I guess it brings that Afro pessimist point to me. I guess also to that end, it brings at that point that all capitalism is racial in that point, and like the exact severity or the different ways that is approached is very local, like approach from the authorities in the region because of like capital's necessity to be regulated by the state. I mean, humans who wouldn't accept capitalism if it wasn't regulated. And I think to me that brings out like a take of mine that I've had for a while from researching like different international things, which is like it brings into the conversation of caste into the conversation, especially when we're talking about America or talking about anywhere where capitalism touches. Even when you look at colonial structures, even early in the beginning, they've always been built on exploiting different hierarchies that they see in a society, whether on purpose or happy accidents. Whatever makes that line go up, which is more exploitation, they're gonna do. And to me, it brings in that demanding of like, especially when we're talking about who has land in America, who has land, who doesn't, who is going to be hit with the most predatory debts. And we can say that it's not necessarily racial, but when you look at how like the history of the United States, economic disenfranchisement, that it is based on a very purposeful caste system inside of the US that I think it doesn't really get talked about like that as much because I just don't think that language is in the United States as much. And also because the caste system here is very informal compared to other places. But yeah, those are the first things that really come to my mind.
That's a really unique analysis. And there's a recent post the Dugout shared critiquing the performance of the protests, how doing the protest becomes a substitute for building power. What does that performance cost us when people are still being disappeared and ICE is hiring more agents and neighborhoods are still under siege?
Yeah, I mean, there's the opportunity cost of not building power in that moment. I mean, mobilizing is great, but mobilizing can be great, but it's one tool in a tool set, and it can help build power. It can help people feel powerful, which is important to building power, because you get to wherever you're demonstrating and there's an extra 100 people there, 200, 300, you're going to feel a little something. You're going to feel a little sure of yourself a bit more, have that communal backing. But what builds actual power is having a structure to organize each individual will for each person to be able to make a collective fist. Because I mean, it takes a couple fingers to make a fist, and that's kind of what we need. And in that, I also think one thing that's lost is legibility. Because if people just see you outside and nothing's happening, then they're just going to think you're just there to be there, which I think is also like a media problem. People not doing their own media, not knowing how and what to post based on operational security. Because there is beautiful, beautiful rapid response work happening all over Turtle Island right now against ICE. But a lot of that will not become unearthed to people who aren't organizers for years. And that to me is depressing. Having different ways to talk about the actual resistance that's going on. I mean, which is where some different or websites like a noblogs.com or other things are, but those aren't really accessible to the masses or the public as much. So we only really get to hear about stuff like that when ICE is like, we've had up to 700% in attacks. We don't have the media apparatus to also tell folks, well, they consider you following them for an hour on 270, a highway, to be an assault. When they had to get out of their car and come harass you and then they left, they considered that an assault. And yeah.
And I think that bridges into another question. You've talked a lot about neighborhood defense, not as like, just like a slogan or anything, but as a strategy, as a tactic. What is the importance of building neighborhood defense in terms of security culture and, the sort of vicious landscape that we're in the US and other places? And what inspires you on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with what inspires me, which is it's something that's consistent in every revolution. You have to have land-based organizing. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, especially if you don't own land or not operating on having large sects of communal land, is working with those around you in your neighborhood. I think also that's where, to me, mutual aid is actually mutual. There's this large setup of serving what's not charity, but is directly aiding people around you that a lot of radicals have been doing, especially over the past 5 years, but creating systems that are actually mutual, that are able to be impacted and impactful by and to people who are using it and who are a part of a network. because to me, mutual aid is a way to describe a network, specifically one with like material or economic impact that decreases one's subsistency off a capitalist economy and one more based off a solidarity-based economy. And I feel like it has a lot more material points of access. Actually drive people, because you're much more willing to do something if you're also organizing yourself and not just trying to organize others. It keeps your drive and commitment to a project.
Anger is often coded as unstrategic, but in your work, rage feels like something that's quite useful. And how do you see rage operating in Black anarchist traditions, not just as emotion, but as method?
I think I see it. I mean, one, it's beautiful because you can't, in my opinion, respect the love of something without also respecting the rage. Love never sits alone. Rage never sits alone. Everything comes in a context. And I think that, especially from the Black tradition or of any oppressed folks, that a lot of times they're so intertwined, and that one's love for something makes you rageful, and one's rage for something, rage either against an injustice, guides you to create new structures and new institutions. I think that, yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I think it's the rage that keeps you in. It's the anger and the love and the inconsistency of the world that makes you want to make something consistent. And yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to speak on that.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've also talked about loneliness on the podcast. When you know what you're seeing, but everyone else is chasing sort of like, the easy, instant sort of gratification or aesthetics. What has sustained you in those moments of political alienation?
Knowing that when I was in that phase, that when I was in my mobilize, that's how we organize phase, that there were other people creating like infrastructure, like movement infrastructure for when I was ready for it. And I know there are some people still doing that now, and I'm in more community with them. And I know that it's a phase or a moment that doesn't or shouldn't last forever. And part of what brings me the joy now is when you stay dedicated, consistent with something and surrounding folks and people that you can be accountable to and move with, that you like watching it grow and watching the impact on other people, as much as reflecting on that impact within myself of having different political formations and different political communities in my life and wanting to give that to others, I feel like is kind of what keeps me going.
There's been a lot of hype around the Zoran Mamdani campaign. What is your take on the campaign, and what does that teach you about electoral politics, sort of political contradictions and proximity to the state?
Yeah, I think I said to someone recently, cool policies already disappointed in the person. And that's just because, like, one, cool, there's going to be a socialist in the settler colonial state of New York, gonna go over New York City. Sure. But, like, he's still going to have a hard time with the unions. Like, it's still politics as is. To me, I think it speaks to a broader ability and need or want for those types of policies, which I think hopefully tells people to organize around them non-electorally, and thinking about how do we, like, what can we get if there's a socialist in office? Because it's not going to last forever, if it even lasts at all. And that it has to be used to build non-electoral strength and build non-electoral infrastructure, which, if they make the state-run grocery stores, cool. That would be dope. It's like, I'm not going to be mad at that, but I'm also not going to act like I expect them to lead the way, nor do I even think that Zoran wants to do that, because he is a union organizer from like years. Like, he did the taxi union, I believe, which was huge. So as an organizer, there's like respect for that. But when it comes to like long-term strategy, I do think as an anarchist, especially, it leads into the question of what do we do and what does it change when socialists start winning elections? And how does the non-electoral socialist front organize around that? And it's something very hard, even in the Black community, but I would say like it has to be based more around the policies and not the people, because that's what's going to unite people. and not be so disappointed.
I think like historically, even if it's the anniversary of the Spanish Revolution and those things, the role of democratic socialists has been kind of destructive towards radical alternatives. I think that also we see that when people, especially in progressive campaigns, get closer to state power, it's harder for them to speak the truth. And that's like a huge question of honesty, because I feel after Occupy, the Bernie movement sort of functioned in that way. What's your take on that in terms of progressive campaigns and what their role has been in recent times?
To me, like as someone looking at resistance history, I see it as an overall positive. It's an opportunity that I think we can organize around. But I think when a lot of people say that, they think we can push him to the left, or we can push these people, or this or that. And it's still like based on the people, when in all actuality, like we should only be caring about the policy. And having like a people-based political system is why like we can lead to so much disappointment. And I think that's part of the danger, is that it gets based around people who have the great capacity to do things, allegedly. I know the limitations of the state, but they don't address that limitation itself. This is something in South America that happens a lot more, which is actual revolutionaries get elected into office and say, I hate the state, vote for me. And they get elected. And like, it's a way to understand a machinery without fetishizing the machinery, or like having a way to like talk about what's around us. Cause that's why I'm like, okay, what grants is he going to make open and available for X, Y, and Z? Like what money will he make available that's already ours? That should be already ours. Like what step in transition will he do to make resources more accessible to modern New Yorkers or stuff like that? All that can be dubs. And I think that it'll be even more of a win if we organize, like I was saying, like non-electoral, like being able to use this moment to boost or bolster non-electoral organizations in different formations, to not be fully around Mamdani or any progressive, but in a policy, which is why I think like Sunrise Movement is able to exist without AOC, and it's still able to like now shit on AOC and go to do office sit-ins in her office, because they're like, we care about one thing and it's a policy. And just because you got in and we were there doesn't mean that we're any nicer to you. Like now you have the job.
I want to shift a bit to the podcast itself. The Dugout is not a traditional progressive podcast. I feel like it's making an intervention in a much needed space about not just practical things we can do on the ground, but also introducing new speakers. I know Prince and you have called out the impulse to platform over politicize. And what were you trying to rupture when you first started? And what did you need that you weren't seeing anywhere else?
Casual conversation. Because that's really what the podcast came out of, was Prince and I's casual conversation, and having friends that are political but not organizing. Like us being organizers and being like, well, there's always that drive of how do you recruit, how do you mobilize, how do you bring people in, especially in like a mass understanding or mass setting. And then there was also just the need to be like, we wish there was something or a place of aggregated information, because it took a lot of labor and study to get to where me and Prince are. And we wanted to shorten that time frame for a lot of people by collectivizing information, putting it in a place that's a lot more easier and accessible, and start building a platform and community around that. I think that's why like soon, by next month, we're going to have like a Dugout website, which I'm excited for, because I am an archivist. I have like over 15,000 radical books on my computer and in a hard drive that like we're sourcing through to make educational modules for folks to be like, what is an intro to Black history, Black power, Black anarchism? What is the internationalism that is based off of? Because that's a very important part of Black anarchism, is its diasporic connection and a part of anarchism in and of itself.
Can you elaborate on that point?
I think that was,
we haven't really discussed it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's part of that. I think the internationalism, actually, I can go back into my notes for making this module. Yeah, I mean, because for Black anarchists, especially in the United States, I think the thing that comes first and foremost when thinking internationally is indigenous solidarity, and the different links between having it like an anti-colonial understanding, thinking about like why do we think we should govern, and what is stopping us from governing, from actually having like a self-managed society. And it is the imperial states around us, the one that is currently occupying Turtle Island, one that is in authority in a lot of other places, whether it be Russia, China, India, or other places. The ability for that other side of organizing, the bottom-up organizing to happen, is because of repression from top-down systems around us that don't want us to organize in another capacity. So it would take away their power. It would take away their economic and social and political power. And that's why, like, when I talk of like Palestinian comrades, I say like those are our comrades because it's solidarity without a border. And I think when looking at other places and other struggles, I feel like this also kind of comes from like an anti-war stance within anarchists, which is like, I have more in common with people who they want me to go fight than the people in my own country who are calling me unpatriotic for not wanting to fight, which is something very strong in indigenous anarchists and all colonial and colonized people, which is like fighting in your colonizer's army and taking those skills and then using them and like building those relationships. So I think like that's a big part of like Pan-Africanism being a big influence on like Black anarchists themselves. Because I mean, we look at Pan-Africanism and its history, like there are like a lot of colonial aspects to it, like Marcus Garvey, let's go fucking colonize Liberia, all the way to like, let's have a Pan-African organization that is either A, based on states, or two, not based on the states and based on different communities and supporting that. And yeah, that to me helped a lot. And then like the alter globalization movement, when that was happening, I feel like that influenced a lot of folks, and that comes from the Zapatistas influencing the Americas and having that connection.
I think there's also this cohesion between you and Prince, because as organizers, we typically see organizers not getting along in many cases. But you also like have your different opinions. You aren't chasing like a consensus. There's always something engaging about your relationship in your podcast. How do you sharpen each other politically, and what does that process actually look like in your work?
That's a really good question. Thank you. All these have been really good too as well. I would say, I think we sharpen each other because one, we take this project seriously, but also not too seriously. That's like kind of one of the taglines. And half of why it's called the Dugout is just like we're high 90% of the time on the show. And
that's a great way to do a podcast.
The beauty of it is it really is. I feel like we sharpen each other by like, I feel like we constantly surprise each other with all the different connections we have had without talking about it. And very surprised by, or I guess we also sharpen ourselves with, I guess it's just the openness and the vulnerability to be able to, and I guess this is kind of the point of me saying over and over again, having people that you feel like you can be accountable to, because then you can mess up around them. You feel like you can make mistakes and you can actually learn in a way that's healing for some people. It's especially healing in this world where mistakes can be punitive or chastised, but very reproductive. Like it's very growth. And I feel like that intention, that growth-based intention is a lot of what like holds us together. And the mutual respect to be able to understand why someone is hesitant around something and be able to take the time to address that. Yeah, I feel like there was another part to that.
And what does that process actually look like when you're preparing for a show? But I think you told a little bit about behind the scenes.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes it'll be like, we make outlines for episodes, and especially on the more history ones, I think it's like taking the time to not only feel like we're teaching the audience, but we're just teaching each other the kind of content. Because some episodes will be like one person just wants to do it, and then we'll bring up the sources, and it'll be like a live learning episode. So all the questions are organic through, and like Prince or I being like, well, no, what does that mean? And there'll be times where like we'll stop recording to like converse about something or to look something up, like mid-episode research, so that we can both like have it really be a communal education project, because I feel like that's really what it is for me and Prince. As much as we want to create something for other people, it's also like a really interesting political diary and political experimentation around our own knowledge base and kind of sharing that with the world. And it's kind of based on understanding the unique position of Black, like diasporically Black anarchists as well, because Prince is Jamaican, I'm Gambian, Fula. And so we have like a very different relationship to our Blackness and to our understanding of like relationship to colonial history, which I feel like is part of what makes like Black anarchism itself so diverse, so elusive as well.
I I really appreciated a term you used before, which was healing. What sort of grief or healing have you experienced as an organizer, and what is your recommendation to organizers who are dealing with things and the importance of healing, and what does healing mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. I think okay, the first thing to address for me is there are multiple things we have to heal from, and we never have to. We're never going to stop needing to heal, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We have things. I think of Jonina Irving, who was one of the last editors in the Black Panther News Party, how she talked about how no one came into the party a revolutionary, but it was through the study and struggle that people became revolutionaries together. And in that, I mean, like, we have to heal parts of ourselves before we come into a political formation or come into a social organization. And we have to heal from the things that we're going to do to each other while we're together.
That's really well said.
Because, yeah. And to me, I think healing really does sometimes, it means stepping back and like taking a full step back. And that's something that I've had to grieve it not happening in political organizations that were very important to me, whether they be based on real material, like really materially beneficial and emotionally beneficial organizations being wrought institutionally with patriarchy is a thing to grieve, because the way in the formation it has, and then knowing that I had to leave that, like there was no changing it from the inside. It is burning too many people before the flame would ever go down. No one ever wanted to really heal from it. No one was really taking that step back to look at just the fire and be like, oh shit. I think that's something to grieve, is like all the different losses, the loss of relationships, the loss of life. I think it's important to me. There's this really good zine that came out from an internationalist that went to Rojava called Martyr Culture by Strangers in the Tangled Wilderness that I think is really important for folks to try to grasp. And also the little audio interview they did with the author, I think, on a good part of martyr culture that I think Americans, like, they talk about in the essay, have a hard part understanding and addressing because of our implication of martyrdom. But I think that understanding that just because someone's not right here next to me fighting with me doesn't mean I can't pull strength from their energy and from their thought. And doing that same thing future and backwards, like fighting for the people in front of us who are going to be in the lineage of the people behind me and of my comrades right now.
I think in one of the podcasts you also discussed about organizing around like Narcan and harm reduction and overdose response as a part of community defense. What does that kind of work look like where you are, and how does it fit into a broader strategy of survival?
Yeah. So I came into a project like that. It's called Mutual Aid Street Solidarity in 2020. And it was kind of one of those like mutual aid, direct aid programs that popped up. And actually, we came out of the Food Not Bombs, because the people at Food Not Bombs in our chapter, they didn't want us to have needles out and accessible. They're like, keep them behind the table. People can ask for them. And we were like, no, we just want to put them on the table, have people grab them, and like, that's it. And it morphed because of the critique of mutual aid and how that was being done through other people. And like through like this like culture of things. And the big critique that me and other folks developed was kind of like this charity versus direct aid versus mutual aid model, or like understanding, which is like a lot of direct aid programs came up, but was it mutual aid? And we still shouldn't abandon mutual aid, because to us, mutual aid was an actual network or system or change in material or economic like worlds. It was fraternity societies. It's self-defense groups coming together. It's a collectively run communal kitchen. It's actual infrastructure that has a different property relation to it versus like direct aid is like not charity because you're not means testing people of like, oh, you need to make this to get that. It's still like a very accessible aiding system that folks are doing without being paternal, but the people who are receiving, their one role is to receive and they can never give. And a lot of different serves were being set up and the serves would set up a table. You're behind one side, you're on the other side. It's good to do that for efficiency reasons because then not have places for people to eat or do their reading or have conversation. It's not really making it a mutual space or a communal space that we argued that were needed. So it moved on from like doing like a weekly serve site to doing more like actual outreach of like street walking and going to camps and being invited to camps, just sitting there talking the shit with people. Doing that way, it's more like doing camp defense, doing more resource allocation. And it became more of like other groups came out of that and different like long-term advocacy where we like people would actually organize to do the advocacy work of helping someone get housed if they wanted to, or get these other things if they wanted to. So getting like collecting resource information, whether it be state or nonprofits, and being there alongside people to help them advocate while they were moving through these different processes. And to me, I think that part of where it's based on building relationships so that now, like 5 years later, there are people who were unhoused or people who are still unhoused, but they're in like the organizing collective of it. Like they're in the process of helping other people that were just like them. And to me, I always do this stuff because I'm one check away from being evicted. I mean, I'll fight the sheriffs, but like I'm very housing insecure myself. So it brought me there. I'm also a drug user. Like this is done by people who use drugs. I've done a lot of different drugs and we just don't want our friends to die. So that's really just like the basis of the group and of coming together was we just don't want our friends to die, especially if they don't have to.
This is a really important intervention, and I think I can feel that dynamic that you're talking about between Food Not Moms and the whole needles thing. So what are the key issues you're paying attention to right now in the U.S., settler colonial U.S., whether it's state violence, labor, housing, or anything else shaping how people are living and struggling?
I mean, definitely paying attention to all. Like I'm an abolitionist and that's where a lot of some of my like main work is. And so doing a lot of like the intersection of like all the concentration camps they're building, kind of like that research of who owns them, where do they live, what do they do for lunch at GEO Group, and how like those contracts with ICE and other things are being developed to kind of map out targets and the people and places that can be held accountable. I think that earlier, like I was saying, like what I'm really paying attention to and trying to get more involved in is movements like the Cooperation Jackson, Cooperation Vermont, Wellspring, and Site that like network for land and liberation to kind of build a long-term coalition of projects inside the United States. Because my thing is like I don't want to build a state, but I want to build an economy, and that means like a largely federated network, and you have to be very intentional about that. But there's also so many people, so many small scale producers, unionized places, jobs, co-ops that are starting, have been around. The hard part of building a new economy is not having other people to do and trade with, not having other people who have like a socialist ethic in their business practice. And even in like understanding, I don't want to build a transitionary state. I want to transition right now, prefiguratively. I want to build a new transitionary thing right now, and it will grow and we will grow. We might need to abandon it, think beyond it, do something else, but having that sort of infrastructure and then the coalition for those different projects to be able to be in relation with each other and build off each other, I think is something that I'm very, very interested in. And again, that has to do with me. I think like getting anarchists back in labor, back in like not even necessarily joining unions, but I think if you think about what the Young Lords did in New York when they took over the hospital, that's mutual aid. You have to organize nurses and doctors. You don't just walk into a hospital in a U-Haul and take it over. Like that's what Patriot Front does. We're talking about real economic building. So I think organizing labor means talking with folks that work, who want to do things, who are voluntary producers, people, and making an ability or like a network where that can become more subsistence based. And that can mean like here in Columbus, we have free stores every month where people can take stuff and drop stuff. And at this point, we have like 4 every month of folks, and they just take stuff and drop stuff off. And I've never had to buy clothes for like the past 4 years. And stuff like that, where I'm able to have less economic reliance on a capitalist network of money and more on a solidarity economy. I'm kind of curious, like what the organizational needs to build that up and make that more sustainable are. And a lot of it comes from land. We need land, and we need to decolonize what that means and have that sort of one like network to structure to like autonomous indigenous organizing. Because I mean, one thing here is that like I was very influenced by indigenous anarchists to even get into anarchism. Before it was like, I hear you, it's cool, let's talk about it. All my friends are anarchists, dope. Being able to add that like decolonial lens to it made it feel more personal, but I also think made it feel more like it was actually something that had a brand of legitimacy that I saw as like, okay, yes, the anti-authoritarian trend. Yeah, and I guess that's probably just like my main point is like organizing the anti-authoritarian sect and movement spaces and not ceding ground to authoritarians. So that's the main issue in society, in my opinion, everywhere, is being out-organized by the damn authoritarians.
What direction do you see the Dugout taking next? And what kind of work do you hope it can nourish?
Yeah, I mean, we are focusing on building out a website now. So building out and making like a big part of what we loved from our position is like, we know just putting out our casual conversations would be enough because like, not to sound arrogant, but it is a unique position that Prince and I hold. It is a perspective, and in a world and having a politics of people who just like listening to other people's perspective to influence theirs, it has this inherent value to it. And a lot of that for us comes through like the different media we've consumed, whether it be books or movies. So building out a place to have that archive more accessible, as well as like I was saying earlier, we're going to be making more like educational modules kind of to work through that, because one thing I suck with is being asked questions on the spot sometimes, especially like so I'm getting into anarchy or communism, what should I read? And I'm like, God, just don't read this. Like, I don't have any real recommendations, but I have like 12,000 books on my computer. So it's kind of a conundrum. So I'm glad to like take the time to actually sift through, organize my library a bit more and be like, this part from this section was influential, and so was this part of this book, and kind of move around the map that way to kind of like map out the influence.
Thank you for appearing on the Organic Filaments Network. That was Jordan.
No, thank you so much for having us on, or me on. Oh, I said us.